Starbucks Iced Apple Crisp Oat Milk Shaken Espresso. Made with blonde espresso, creamy oat milk, and spiced apple flavors. It's an icy crisp sip you can enjoy all autumn long. Order ahead on the Starbucks app.
When raising a Pacifico beer with friends you just met turns into hitting up their friend's local art show, getting inspired to create something together, and painting your first mural, you found what was waiting for you. Pacifico. Life's waiting. 21 plus only. Discover responsibly. Pacifico Clara Beer. Imported by Crown Imports, Chicago, Illinois.
At Ashley, you'll find colorful furniture that brings your home to life. Ashley makes it easier than ever to express your personal style with an array of looks in fun trending hues to choose from earth tones to vibrant colors to calming blues and greens. Ashley has pieces for every room in the house in the season's most sought-after shades. A more colorful life starts at Ashley. Shop in store or online today. Ashley, for the love of home.
What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Before we begin, I want to clarify that in today's episode I will be referring to Madame de Pompadour by her birth name, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, as I describe her early life. Once she is granted the title of Madame de Pompadour, I will refer to her as Madame de Pompadour. Please note that in one quote in this episode, she is also referred to as Madame d'Étoile. When Jeanne Antoinette Poisson was 9 years old, a psychic read her future and told her that she would one day become the king's mistress. Though she was born into a bourgeois family and never before had a woman of the middle class become the king's mistress, Jeanne Antoinette defied all odds and fulfilled her prophecy, becoming not only King Louis XV's long-term mistress, but also his closest confidant and political advisor. Listeners, today I share with you the remarkable story of Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, better known by her later title, Madame de Pompadour. After hearing her fortune, Jeanne Antoinette became convinced that not only would she grow up to love the king, but that he would fall equally in love with her. From a young age, she was groomed to become the king's mistress. With the aid of her mother and her undeterred determination, Jeanne Antoinette received an impressive education. She eventually married and moved into an estate near one of the king's hunting lodges. When the king went on his hunting escapades, Jeanne Antoinette would drive her chariot past him, being sure she caught the king's attention with her magnanimous smile. It certainly helped that Jeanne Antoinette was exceptionally beautiful and had already earned a reputation as the most beautiful woman in all of Paris. Jeanne Antoinette eventually officially met the king at a masked ball, and the two fell in love at first sight. Jeanne Antoinette would remain by the king's side as his most notable mistress for the next 20 years. Though it may sound like a fairy tale, it was undeniably Jeanne Antoinette's own single-minded willpower that not only turned her dream into a reality, but granted her access to the French royal court. Given the prestigious title of Madame de Pompadour, she became far more than just the king's mistress. As the years went on, Madame de Pompadour worked her way up to the most powerful branch of the court. She secured herself titles of nobility, placed her family and friends in powerful positions, built a trusted community within the court, and made sure any of her enemies were swiftly removed. She eventually graduated from the king's mistress to his political advisor, taking charge of the king's schedule and at times even making decisions on his behalf. By the mid-1750s, Madame de Pompadour became involved with foreign affairs. In fact, it was Madame de Pompadour who made most of the decisions on France's behalf during the 7 Years' War, while the king was off hunting. Unfortunately, Madame de Pompadour did not prove to be the savviest war advisor, and took much of the blame for France's humiliating defeat. Though it cannot be denied that some of her decisions during the 7 Years' War turned disastrous for France, the fact that not only the king's mistress, an innately subordinate position within the court, but a woman of bourgeois origins had practically taken charge of the entire country is unquestionably remarkable. And what Madame de Pompadour may have lacked in her political skills, she certainly made up for with her important patronage of art. Madame de Pompadour played an essential role in turning Paris into the center of cultural refinement and taste in Europe. From her earliest days at court, Madame de Pompadour focused much of her efforts on the cultivation of art, theater, and architecture. One of her first endeavors was to establish a private theater for the king, where performances of Paris's greatest plays and operas could be performed, with Madame de Pompadour playing the leading roles herself, but of course. She rallied the king behind major architectural projects and designed several chateaux and lodges for them to enjoy. Madame de Pompadour would take it upon herself to decorate these spaces with unique paintings and sculptures by France's very best artists. One home in particular, named Bellevue, became an artistic haven, with walls painted by Charles Van Loo and François Boucher. She would become Boucher's favorite model, and he her favorite painter, and she can be found in at least 9 separate portraits by Boucher. Through her patronage, Madame de Pompadour greatly influenced and inspired the development of the Rococo style, famous today for its lavishness and frivolity. Madame de Pompadour developed a passion for porcelain as well, and even purchased her own royal porcelain factory at Sèvres. The factory went on to become one of the most renowned porcelain manufacturers in all of Europe. She also worked closely with France's best gemstone engravers, who she not only commissioned works from, but had them teach her how to engrave stones herself. She eventually got her own engraving equipment and made a small collection of engraved precious stones. And she was also an amateur printmaker, taught by Boucher himself, and made prints of many of his paintings. Her artistic endeavors parallel her intellectual ones. Madame de Pompadour had an impressive book collection, not only acquiring, but actually reading a massive amount of important works of literature. She surrounded herself with the intellectuals of the French Enlightenment, like Diderot and Voltaire, and often engaged in academic discourse. She strongly lobbied for France's first encyclopedia to be published, against the favor of much of the court. Although it should be noted that in her later years she did rescind her support out of concern that the encyclopedia had become anti-royalist. Nonetheless, her scholarly pursuits, in conjunction with her support and participation in the arts, attest to Madame de Pompadour's immense creative spirit and astute mind. It is inarguable that Madame de Pompadour and her expensive taste for art, architecture, and decor, often at the expense of taxpayer dollars, set the stage for the growing unrest within France's lower classes. This unrest would eventually lead to the French Revolution. In fact, the revolution began just 25 years after Madame de Pompadour's death. Spared the guillotine, Madame de Pompadour was one of the last of her generation to enjoy the ostentatiousness of the French royal court, before it would be turned on its head, or shall I say, off with its head, in one of the greatest revolutions in the history of mankind. Madame de Pompadour has often unfairly been written off as a power-hungry woman who manipulated the king with seduction to gain political control. But today, we honor her legacy in full and give her her much-deserved credit as a fearless woman who went after her wildest of dreams and broke countless barriers within the rigid confines of the French court. Like the Rococo famed work, Fragonard's The Swing, we are about to be taken on a frivolous ride with luxury beyond belief and danger lurking just below our toes. So without further ado, I present to you Madame de Pompadour. Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson was born in Paris on December 29, 1721. She was baptized 2 days later at the church of Saint-Eustache. Her father, François Poisson, was from a respectable bourgeoisie family. He worked as a steward to the Paris brothers, who were primarily in charge of France's economy at the time. More specifically, he was a procurement agent for the French army, brokering deals for goods on the army's behalf. By the time he met Jeanne-Antoinette's mother, he was in his 40s and recently widowed after his first wife died. Jeanne-Antoinette's mother, Louise Madeleine de la Motte, was from an equally respectable family. Her father was an official of the War Ministry, a noteworthy position. Louise Madeleine was known all around Paris for her breathtaking beauty. But this beauty was not without brains, and she was also known for her intellect. As a rare surviving description of Louise noted, she was as clever as the four devils. When Louise married François Poisson in October of 1718, she was not yet 20 years old. Given their age difference of over 20 years, we can imagine that this marriage was not so much a union of love, at least not on Louise's part. It was most likely agreed upon by Louise's family to place her in a suitable household. Because François was often away on business, Louise was known to have many lovers around Paris. Dozens of the city's wealthiest and most handsome men were rumored to have had an affair with her. This has led to questions surrounding Jeanne-Antoinette's paternity, speculating that François may not have been her biological father. There is some evidence to support that Jeanne-Antoinette's real father was actually a man named Charles de Tournem, a tax farmer and long-term lover of Louise. Though we will never know if this is true, Tournem would go on to play a paternal role through Jeanne-Antoinette's life and remained one of her biggest supporters. Though it should be noted that Jeanne-Antoinette herself believed her father was François Poisson, and always treated him as such. To lend to this mystery, we do not know much about Jeanne-Antoinette's early childhood. Being born into a middle-class family, we can imagine that she lived a more than comfortable early life. Their family home was on the outskirts of Paris, en Rue de Cléry, in today's 2nd arrondissement. Though a middle-class neighborhood, their home still would have had a staff of servants at their attendance. They also owned a personal carriage, which the family would use for travel. At the age of 3, Jeanne-Antoinette welcomed a younger brother, whom she would remain close to and look after for the rest of her life. What may have seemed like a relatively unremarkable childhood would soon take a dark turn. In 1725, when Jeanne-Antoinette was only 4 years old, her father was caught up in a black market scandal and exiled from France. He was accused of buying mass amounts of wheat for cheap, assuming the cost of wheat would then go up. But his misstep was partially responsible for a widespread famine in Paris later that year. While his employer was sent to Bastille, France's famous state prison, his charges were eventually dropped. It was François that took the greatest hit, and many saw him as a scapegoat. Exiled from France, François took refuge in Germany, where he would remain for the next decade. Françoise's exile not only meant that Jeanne Antoinette would no longer be able to see her father, but the scandal brought an immense amount of shame upon their family. Though she was young, Jeanne Antoinette must have felt her mother's palpable embarrassment. And if that wasn't enough, their house and all of their belongings were seized, forcing Jeanne Antoinette with her mother and brother to move to a small apartment in a lower-class area in Paris. How did little Jeanne Antoinette feel to see her father exiled from their home, not knowing when she would be able to see him again? Was she full of grief, or rather resentment, that he had put her family in such a humiliating situation? Did she feel a sense of protection for her mother? And how did she feel as she watched her home and all of their belongings confiscated? Did they take away little Jeanne Antoinette's favorite toys, dresses, and dolls? We can only imagine the devastating effects the situation must have had on Jeanne Antoinette. But her mother put on a brave face and turned to her many prominent connections to help the family settle into a new life. Jeanne Antoinette would learn from her mother at an early age the power of resilience, and to never let even the most tragic of circumstances defeat her. Louise did all she could to make sure her two children remained safe, especially little Jeanne Antoinette, who her mother affectionately called Reinette, or Little Queen. As much as she treasured her little girl, Louise knew that the best way to keep little Jeanne Antoinette safe would be to send her to a convent for schooling, at least until the dust settled. And so, Jeanne Antoinette, at just 5 years old, spent the next 3 years at the Ursuline convent in Poissy, just a few miles outside of Paris. The Ursuline convent was likely selected because Jeanne Antoinette's 2 aunts were nuns there and could keep a careful eye on her. The convent proved to be not only a secure landing pad for Jeanne Antoinette, but provided the ideal foundational education Jeanne Antoinette needed to learn the ways of being a lady. The convent specialized in the education of daughters of the bourgeoisie and trained them to later become respectable wives, mothers, and women of faith. Jeanne Antoinette flourished during her time at the convent, and she captured the hearts of many of the nuns. One of these nuns wrote in a letter to Jeanne Antoinette's father in exile, "Your amiable daughter, monsieur, is well and pretty, and feeling altogether at her ease. She is not at all bored with us, quite the contrary." But she also suffered several spouts of poor health. The nuns would try their best to nourish her with homemade soup and fresh eggs. But in November of 1729, she caught a bad case of the whooping cough and was bedridden for 6 weeks. The sickness brought an end to her time at the convent, and the 8-year-old Jeanne Antoinette was once again returned to the care of her mother. The nuns were heartbroken to see her go, writing to her father, "They have told us that she no longer has a fever, that she is better, that she is very pleased to be with her mother. It seems likely that she is going to stay there, and so, monsieur, we no longer have news of her. We leave it to you to keep in touch about her, as we take a great deal of interest in her and love her tenderly. She is always very amiable and so pleasing that she charms everyone who sees her." Even in her earliest days, Jeanne Antoinette couldn't help but charm all of those around her. Life with her mother in Paris was very different from her life at the convent. Her mother's many love affairs and more bohemian ways must have been more apparent to the now older Jeanne Antoinette. When she turned 9, her mother took Jeanne Antoinette to a psychic to have her fortune read. They went to the well-known fortune teller named Madame Le Bon. As Madame Le Bon looked into the young Jeanne Antoinette's palms, she gasped at what she saw. She stared deep into Jeanne Antoinette's eyes and exclaimed, "You will one day become King Louis XV's mistress." How did Jeanne Antoinette feel as she listened to her fortune? Did she find it ridiculous, an impossible, far-away dream that surely could never be her reality? Or did a small part of her believe Madame Le Bon? Did Madame Le Bon tell her something that the young Jean Antoinette already knew? Both daughter and mother could barely believe their ears. As Jean Antoinette later recalled, Madame Le Bon's fortune struck her with the force of a thunderbolt. She had always had a secret presentiment that she would be loved by the king, and that she felt a violent inclination for him. Though to many this fortune would have sounded as preposterous as the sky falling down, Jean Antoinette and her mother became convinced of Jean Antoinette's destiny. It was never a question of if, but rather how. It would take a lot of work, education, grooming, and perhaps most of all, luck. But mother and daughter fearlessly began to do all they could to turn this fantastical prophecy into a reality. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers.
Hear that? Pumpkin. That's fall calling. And the pumpkin spice latte is back at Starbucks. From that first sweater to late autumn weather, it's all of fall in just one sip. Order ahead on the Starbucks app.
At Ashley, you'll find colorful furniture that brings your home to life. Ashley makes it easier than ever to express your personal style with an array of looks in fun trending hues to choose from earth tones to vibrant colors to calming blues and greens. Ashley has pieces for every room in the house in the season's most sought-after shades. A more colorful life starts at Ashley. Shop in store, online today. Ashley, for the love of home.
Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. So who was Jean Antoinette's man of her dreams, this King Louis XV? King Louis XV was crowned king when he was only 5 years old, after his father, mother, and siblings all died from measles within the same week. Because he was so young, they appointed men to act on his behalf, and King Louis XV was able to spend his childhood away from court with his uncle. But by the time he turned an adolescent, he had to take on his duties as king and move to Versailles. At Versailles, he had virtually no privacy, with people even watching him as he ate his meals. He hated being under constant surveillance and recoiled at the attention. When he was 15 years old, he became engaged to the Infanta of Spain, who was only 5 years old. While she moved into Versailles, the king had to wait 10 years to consummate the marriage. The whole ordeal left King Louis XV feeling more and more humiliated. Luckily, for all parties, the Infanta was deemed too young and returned to Spain. His advisors set out to find a wife closer to his own age. They settled on Maria Leszczyńska, the Princess of Poland, who was 7 years the king's elder. The two were married, and at first the king seemed madly in love with his new wife. By 1730, at the time that Jean Antoinette was told her prophecy, the king was 20 years old, and already the father of 5 children. He was known to be both a devoted father and husband, and dutifully faithful to his wife. Though he remained a largely mysterious figure to the French public, spending most of his time at Versailles, he was known to be exceptionally handsome and considered a good king. The fact that Louis XV was not only king of France, but a handsome king at that, and one that was faithful to his wife, made Jean Antoinette's dream sound downright absurd, but she was never deterred by the impossibility of it. And so, mother and daughter set out a plan. They turned to Louise's longtime lover, Charles de Tournem, to help turn their ploy into action. Whether Tournem was Jean Antoinette's secret biological father or not, he certainly took her in as his own, and dedicated himself to funding her dream. Without children of his own, little Jean-Antoinette must have felt as close to kin as one could be. He went to great lengths to provide for Jean-Antoinette, and it can be safely said that without Tournem's support, her dream would have forever remained a fantasy. It was Tournem who took charge of continuing Jean-Antoinette's education, focused on the arts, culture, and refinement. Over the next few years, Tournem arranged lessons in singing, dancing, and even acting. Jean-Antoinette became well-versed in theater. Some performances she even memorized by heart. She learned to play the clavichord to perfection and how to draw, paint, and embroider. She was trained to be an excellent housekeeper, especially taking interest in gardening and botany. Her conversation skills excelled, and she learned the tricks of being an excellent host. She even learned to drive her own carriage, something that would later greatly impress the king. Jean-Antoinette excelled in each of these lessons, and they transformed her from a good-natured girl into an intelligent, highly skilled, and impressive young woman. When Jean-Antoinette was 15 years old, her father's sentence was revoked, and he was allowed to return to Paris. How did it feel to see her father again after so much time? Was she overjoyed by the news, or was she apprehensive? Did she welcome her father back with open arms, or was she embarrassed at his tarnished reputation? Did she even remember him? How much had he changed? Was she open to him playing an active role in her life again? It seems that Jean-Antoinette took her father's return as she did most things in life, with grace and dignity. She would continue to maintain a close relationship with her father through her life, and went out of her way to take care of him. After a decade away, François Poisson could not believe that the young woman standing before his eyes was the same little girl he knew to be his daughter. She was not only talented in every facet of life, but she had blossomed into a stunningly beautiful woman. She was tall, with porcelain skin and soft brown hair. She had a dazzling smile, with a full set of pearly white teeth, a rarity at the time, and her eyes were a unique mix of blue, gray, and green. A gatekeeper at Versailles once wrote, "Her eyes had a particular attraction, perhaps owing to the fact that it was difficult to say exactly what color they were. They had neither the hard sparkle of black eyes, nor the dreamy tenderness of blue, nor the special delicacy of gray. Their indeterminate color seemed to lend them all forms of seduction and shades of expression." As Jean-Antoinette neared 18, it was time for her to find a suitable husband, not only to care for her, but to provide her with access to the prestigious circles of Paris. With such unrivaled good looks and the brains and skills to back it up, one would assume that Jean-Antoinette had suitors lined down the street. So it comes with some surprise that Jean-Antoinette actually found it increasingly difficult to find a man willing to marry her. This had little to do with Jean-Antoinette herself. Her father's scandalous reputation continued to haunt her, as did her mother's track record for promiscuity. It seemed that both her parents' less than favorable respectability tarnished Jean-Antoinette's good name. She began to face rejection after rejection, and we can only imagine the humiliation that she endured. In her time of need, she would once again turn to Tournem for help, and help he did. In the end, Tournem convinced his nephew, Charles Guillaume Lenormand, to take Jean-Antoinette's hand in marriage. He not only offered his nephew a hefty dowry, but also a job as a junior partner in his tax collection firm. To top it off, he would provide the young couple a home within his enormous estate, with all expenses paid for. It was a deal too good to refuse, and in March of 1741, Jean-Antoinette finally got married. It didn't take long for Charles Lenormand to fall madly in love with his new wife. And though he wasn't the king, Jean-Antoinette began to fall in love with him too. In fact, she would often joke to her new husband that she would never leave him for anyone, except of course King Louis XV. Unfortunately, for Charles Lenormand, what seemed like an innocent joke would one day become his worst nightmare. Nonetheless, these early days of marriage were blissful. Charles was shy and accommodating to any of Jean Antoinette's needs. His family welcomed her in as their own. Because Jean Antoinette would have been acquainted with the Lenormand family through Tournem, she must have felt a sense of comfort in their familiarity. We can imagine this made married life an easy and welcomed adjustment. One of the biggest perks of early married life was moving in with Tournem in the Château d'Étiole, a sprawling estate a few miles south of Paris, along the banks of the Seine River, and surrounded by the Sénart forest. Étiole was the estate of Jean Antoinette's dreams. The property consisted of 2 chateaux and a vast garden filled with rare flowers. The property had farms with cows and chickens and endless supplies of local wine. As part of the marriage contract, Jean Antoinette and her husband had all expenses paid, and they enjoyed servants, elegant carriages, horses, ornate gowns and jewelry, and all other accommodations free of charge. Though it wasn't Versailles, Jean Antoinette greatly enjoyed her first taste of real luxury. Tournem, who had a soft spot for Jean Antoinette, spent a significant amount of money renovating the estate to Jean Antoinette's liking. He catered to her every ask, no matter how grand or expensive. Soon after the move, Jean Antoinette asked if she could have a private theater built on the grounds, where productions of Paris's best plays and operas could be performed. Like a genie in a bottle, her wish was quickly granted, and Tournem built a luxurious theater in the gardens. Not only were the best of the Parisian stage performed here, but Jean Antoinette herself always played the leading role, having a natural talent for singing and acting. Though Jean Antoinette did genuinely love her husband, it was more from a place of affection than passion. By all accounts, Jean Antoinette did not seem to enjoy a particularly steamy relationship with Charles, and engaged in sexual affairs as little as possible. But they were intimate enough for Jean Antoinette to become pregnant shortly after their marriage. She gave birth to a baby boy in December of 1741. But unfortunately, he died within his first year of life. We can only imagine that the death of her firstborn was devastating for Jean Antoinette. But she did overall seem far more interested in establishing her reputation within the social circles of Paris than being a wife or mother. With their move to Étiole, Jean Antoinette could take the name of Madame d'Étiole, which granted her a title of prestige. She began to frequent the famous salons of Paris, filled with the brightest writers, intellectuals, and philosophers in the city. Jean Antoinette enjoyed participating in heated debates and staying up to date with the latest literature. She also began attending the annual Salon exhibition at the Louvre, where works by the greatest artists were on display. It was at these salons that Jean Antoinette honed her social skills and refined her ability to charm anyone in her wake. She was quickly becoming known around Paris's most fashionable social circles. As the magistrate Henault wrote in 1742, "I have just met one of the prettiest women I have ever seen. She knows music perfectly, sings with all the taste and gaiety in the world, knows 100 songs, plays in the comedy at Étiole in a theater as fine as the opera in Paris." After attending the city's best salons, Jean Antoinette set out to create her own at Étiole. She dreamed of turning Étiole into a center where creativity and intellectualism could blossom. She began hosting Paris's chicest society women, writers, and entertainers. She proved to be the ideal host, elegant, good-looking, took a genuine interest in those around her, and was well-read and versed in the topics of the day. Her salon soon began to attract Paris's cultural elite, and her guests even included the famed Voltaire. In fact, Voltaire took a particular liking to Jeanne Antoinette. Around this time, he wrote to a friend that Jeanne Antoinette was well brought up, amiable, good, charming, and talented. She was born sensible and kind-hearted. It didn't take long for Jeanne Antoinette's salon to rival the best salons of Paris, and her work as a hostess became the center of her life. All the while that Jeanne Antoinette was navigating married life and building her reputation as the host of the hottest salon in town, things had drastically changed for the king and his relationship with the queen. Unfortunately, the burning desire of their early marriage died down after a few years. Many children later, and as the queen settled into middle age, she much preferred to play cards with her friends than keep her husband's attention. Though hesitant at first, the king, known for his insatiable appetite for sexual pleasure, could not resist the urge to find himself a mistress who could keep him satisfied. And thus was the beginning of what can only be described as a bizarre series of events marking the king's early days keeping mistresses. His first mistress was a woman of the court named Louise Julie de Mailly. Though she wasn't the most beautiful, the king enjoyed her sense of humor and found their secret meetups enthralling. But soon after their affair started, the king began a second affair with Louise's sister, Pauline, who he decided he liked more. Pauline eventually became pregnant with the king's child, but died in childbirth, at which point the king once again returned to Louise. It took less than a month for the king to leave Louise again for her sister, this time her youngest sister Marie Anne. If it wasn't bad enough that the king had dumped Louise for her sister not once but twice, Marie Anne proved to be a jealous lover and convinced the king to banish Louise from Versailles. Marie Anne would become Jeanne Antoinette's most notable predecessor as mistress to the king. She remained the king's mistress for a few years, until she died unexpectedly of pneumonia in December of 1744, leaving the king devastated. And more than this, the king was lonely. Now that he had gotten his taste, he couldn't live long without another mistress to placate his sexual desires, keep him company, and provide emotional support. And who better to fill this role than the woman who had been working towards this position for her entire life? The time had finally come for Jeanne Antoinette to make her first move. Jeanne Antoinette was keeping tabs on the king and was well aware of the death of his latest mistress. Though she was busying herself with Paris's social circles, was married to a notable and adoring husband, and now navigating early motherhood, after giving birth to a healthy baby girl named Alexandrine, she could never forget the prophecy the fortune teller had told her as a child. She was at the prime of her beauty, and she wouldn't let the perfect moment go to waste. It was an audacious mission. Never before had the king taken a mistress outside the court, and certainly not one of bourgeoisie origins. But the fact that it had never been done before didn't stop Jeanne Antoinette. Perhaps it even fueled her. With his mistress dead and the king unattached, Jeanne Antoinette marshaled all her forces to get the king's attention. With the help of her mother and her benefactor Tournem, a plan was set in motion. Every August, King Louis XV would spend a month-long hunting retreat in his chateau near the Senart forest. This chateau was conveniently very close to Étiale, and Jeanne Antoinette took advantage of his proximity. While the king went out hunting with his royal party, Jeanne Antoinette took her carriage into the forest, dressed in her finest outfit, and drove past the king. Although the bourgeoisie were not allowed to ride with the king, and certainly not a bourgeoisie woman, Jeanne Antoinette was able to play innocent, pretending she happened to be out on a ride by her home. As Jeanne Antoinette gallantly rode her carriage by, she made sure to flash the king her brightest smile. Not only did the king stop in his tracks at her beauty, but he couldn't believe that such a delicate young woman could drive a carriage so skillfully. Though far from a formal introduction, Jeanne Antoinette was officially on the king's radar. And their formal introduction would soon follow. In February of 1745, King Louis XV's son was throwing a grand masked ball in Versailles for his wedding. When Jeanne Antoinette heard of the event, she managed to score an invite through her circle of influential friends. Not only would the king be there, but every beautiful woman of Paris would be trying her chances to get the king's attention. But competition never deterred Jeanne Antoinette. Ahead of the ball, she asked Tournam to send her husband away on business and found herself the most elegant gown imaginable. As she entered the ball, she masterfully worked her way towards the king and struck up a flirtatious conversation. What were Jeanne Antoinette's first words to the king? Who spoke first? Was she nervous, shy, second-guessing herself? Or was she filled with confidence, driven by her unfaltering faith that her whole life was building up to this very moment? Unfortunately, the details of this first official encounter do not survive. We know, however, that the king was immediately taken with Jeanne Antoinette. He spent the entire evening deep in conversation with her, barely breaking his stare. As the hours went by, it became more and more obvious to the hopeful women waiting for their pass that the king had found his next lover. Before the evening ended, the king asked Jeanne Antoinette to meet him again the following Sunday at a ball at the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. Meeting again only solidified their instant connection. Jeanne Antoinette left Versailles at 8:30 the morning after the ball. She was seen sneaking out the back entrance of the palace. What many would call a walk of shame was easily the greatest moment of Jeanne Antoinette's life. Against all odds, she had actually become the king's lover. What was that first night together like? Was Jeanne Antoinette filled with passion and excitement? Did it all feel like a dream? For the next 2 months, Jeanne Antoinette and the king enjoyed a low-profile love affair. Rumors began to spread that the king had a new mistress, the prettiest woman in all of Paris. A Parisian lawyer named Barbier wrote of these beginning days. They are talking about a young woman of Paris called Mademoiselle d'Etiolles. She is 22 and truly one of the prettiest women of Paris. They say that the king saw her at a hunt in the forests of Senart, and that since then she has been at the balls and all the celebrations at Versailles, which has made one assume that there is something special here. People began to wonder if this was a passing romance, or if their affair was quickly becoming serious. The possibility that Jeanne Antoinette could become more than a short-lived fling began to cause an uproar amongst the court. That a bourgeoisie woman could become the king's official mistress was unheard of and borderline blasphemy. Though not without its discriminations, the king's mistress was still a notable position at court, and never before had someone not born and bred within the court take on that role. But Jeanne Antoinette could care less about their concerns. She was said to be so head over heels with the king and excited about their burgeoning relationship that she could hardly sleep at night. It is Voltaire who gives us some insight into how Jeanne Antoinette was feeling in these beginning days of her affair with the king. As he recalled, "When she finally held the king in her arms, she told me that she had firmly believed in her destiny and that she had been proved right." Their union seemed to be driven by a greater force, a fate beyond the court and even the king's control. Jeanne Antoinette's destiny was to be fulfilled, and there was no turning back. I hope you have enjoyed part 1 of our 2-part episode on Jeanne Antoinette, later known as Madame de Pompadour. We will finish her story and honor her immense legacy in part 2 of this episode. I've included images, resources, and suggestions for further reading on the ArtMuse website and Instagram. ArtMuse is produced by Kula Production Company. Today's episode was written by me, your host, Grace Anna. Stay tuned as I continue to share the stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art. Until next time, bye for now.
At Ashley, you'll find colorful furniture that brings your home to life. Ashley makes it easier than ever to express your personal style with an array of looks in fun trending hues to choose from earth tones to vibrant colors to calming blues and greens. Ashley has pieces for every room in the house in the season's most sought-after shades. A more colorful life starts at Ashley. Shop in store or online today. Ashley, for the love of home.